Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Cover Crops on a Budget, Financial Considerations for Beginners. My name is Olivia Cayuet, and I'm a Soil Health Program Manager with the University of Missouri Center for Regenerative Agriculture. I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Erin Gundy and Anne-Marie Calabro with the Soil Health Institute. We three support the education component of Farmers for Soil Health. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide farmers, crop advisors, conservation professionals, and others interested with important information related to cover crop budget considerations and thoughts for long-term planning. Today's webinar is supported by Farmers for Soil Health, or FSH. The initiative is one of many USDA-funded Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities projects. FSH is a collaborative initiative among commodity organizations, the United Soybean Board, the National Corn Growers Association, and the National Pork Board, with a goal to increase cover crop adoption. This specific project provides an incentive to farmers who are new to planting cover crops or who have been planting cover crops for many years, as well as offering a sustainability marketplace to connect the farmer to the supply chain. State-level commodity organizations working across 20 states, stretching from North Dakota to the East Coast, are involved with FSH, provide local technical assistance and outreach programming. FSH also developed a website full of resources and information helpful to any of you working with farmers or if you're a farmer or landowner. You can learn more about FSH at farmersforsoilhealth.com. And that link will be put in our chat. Enrollment for 2024 fall planted cover crops is open now through February 2025. Lastly, a few items about today's event. This presentation is being recorded and an email will be sent in the next week with a link to the webinar recording posted to the CRA YouTube channel, along with additional resources and a follow-up survey. We will be working through the webinar in 3 sections relating to cover crop economics. We're going to start with Alan Weber's on-farm experiences, hear more about herbicide resistance, and then talk about cover crop grazing. We'll also have time at the end for general Q&A. So as questions come up, please put those in the Q&A. You can upvote questions that you'd like to prioritize that we cover live. If you'd like captions on, those can be enabled by clicking the 3 dots on your toolbar and navigating to captions. Be sure to hang on till the end for information related to the One Certified Crop Advisor Continuing Education Unit for attending this webinar. With that being said, I'm excited to introduce our guest, Alan Weber. I'll let Alan introduce himself and take it away.
Okay, perfect. And thanks, Olivia, and definitely appreciate the invitation from Farmers for Soil Health to be able to be with you today and to be able to talk. I'm looking forward to the questions, actually. I think that I probably enjoy the Q&A portion of these events as much as anything. So feel free to be able to put questions into the Q&A as Olivia just had outlined. Our topic for today is the economics of cover crops. It's one of those things, as I talk to growers, I'm always amazed with everybody views profitability and return on investment just a little bit different for their farm. And that makes 100% sense. I mean, if you think about how we actually recommend cover crops, we always say, look at an individual field on your farm and what do you want to do with that field? Or what do you want to modify or potentially change? And from that has a big determinant on what cover crop you would potentially use, how you would manage it. And of course, we have different soils by field, by farm. So to me, it's perfect sense that whenever I say, profitability of cover crops, everybody has a slightly different take on that. So I had a chance a few years ago to work on a publication that presented a framework for how we can think about or consider the economics of cover crops. And what I'd like to do today is to be able to, there we go. I'd like to be able to talk a little bit about our own farm experiences and then relate it back to that particular bulletin that we put together. And I'll introduce that bulletin in just a little bit. But if I'm going to be talking more and more about some of my own experiences on our farm, I thought it might be relevant to be able to describe that in a little bit more detail. So one of the most important things probably is the fact that I actually work full time and farm part time. So in the spring during planting season, I'm going to be there every day. In the fall during harvest, here pretty quick, I'll be out there every day. But in the winter, for example, maybe only on weekends. And you'll see that that has an impact on our cover crop use and selection from a labor perspective. So we're a diversified crop and livestock farm, about 875 acres, two different farms, two different counties, and we have both hill ground as well as creek bottom ground. So in the pictures that you see there, that's hill ground on the top. The bottom is some of our creek bottom land. The creek is actually running there on the far right-hand side of the screen. We are about 85 miles east of Kansas City and then located in Pettis County. And I think that it's always relevant to be able to understand that in Pettis County, for example, out of that 875 acres, we actually row crop less than half of it, and the rest of that's going to be pasture, timber, as well as hay ground. So if I was truthful with myself, we're better cattle country than anything else. And to give you a point of reference, I looked up a couple of years ago, and I'm sure it really hasn't changed much. The APH on corn in Pettis County is around 155 bushels per acre. Beans would be about 45 bushels per acre. So we're a moisture or a water limited soil. We're definitely not an I state in terms of yields. But by having cattle, which is pretty significant for our farm, it gives you an idea too about how livestock can actually play into the role of economics of cover crop use as well. Now, I would say that at least in our area, over the past 5 to 10 years, I feel like I've seen more and more use of cover crops. And I think that's true on a national basis as well. If we go back 10 or 12 years back to a previous census of agriculture and then look forward, we had a pretty big jump in acres between 2012 and 2017. And then most recently, between 2017 and 2022, another like 17% jump in terms of the use of cover crops, but still less than 20 million acres nationwide. So we have a lot of room to grow, so to speak. And when I, ask a grower, I'm like, well, why are you using cover crops? Or more specifically, why are you not using cover crops? I think a lot of the time it comes back to this mindset that we've been in since we were knee high out at the farm. And everything we think about is in terms of annual costs and annual revenues. And annual costs, easy to understand in terms of the additional cost of seed. We could even think about reduced costs in terms of maybe less fertility or less herbicide. But some of those longer term benefits that we think about in terms of soil aggregate structure, water infiltration, increased soil organic matter, those are benefits that accrue over a longer period of time. So maybe not as easy for us to see on our income statement. And for sure, sometimes our bankers are asking us that same particular question. So the bulletin I referred to, it kind of gives us a framework about how to look at not just the annual, but those longer term benefits as well. We utilized 5 years worth of information and data coming from surveys that were conducted by CTIC and SARE. CTIC is the Conservation Tillage Information Center. SARE is the Sustainable Ag Research and Education Organization. I should have added too, ASTA, the American Seed Trade Association, was also involved in these surveys. So these 5 years of data, they allowed us to look at things such as the cost of seed, what kind of cover crop seed producers were using, most likely, but it also allowed us to be able to look at yields of fields where cover crops were being used versus not. The very first year that we did this survey was actually more than a decade ago, back in 2012. And everybody on this call that farms, the second I say 2012, you probably cringe just a little bit because it was a drought year that extended well across the Midwest. So in 2013, when we got the survey data back and we first saw these yield impacts, and this question that was asked of farmers was essentially, if you're using cover crops on a field, report your yields. And then if you could report yields on a field in which cover crops are not being used, that is adjacent to or a similar soil type. And these responses coming back were like 10% changes in yields positively for fields that were using cover crops for both corn and beans. So we decided not to do anything with that information. We knew we were running another year of the survey. And then as you can see in 13, 14, 15, and 16, the information coming back was still positive, that producers on average were seeing increases in yields by using cover crops, but nothing like that drought stressed year in 2012. Just to give you an idea, 2014 is just the opposite, at least in our area, than 2012. 2012 extreme drought. 2014 was some of the best weather and some of the best yields that I think that we've seen in our particular county, as an example. But in most cases, we were seeing 2% increases in corn and 3.5 to 4% increases in soybeans. Now, ASTA and SARE and CTIC, they've done this survey multiple times over. This is just another set of survey results. I guess I'm just trying to reinforce that those yields are consistent, that the growers that are surveyed and responding are seeing yields on average that are increased by using cover crops versus fields where they're not using cover crops consistently. But as we were looking at this information, we were starting to notice a trend, because in the demographics portion, we were asking producers about how many years of experience that they had with cover crops. So in 2015 and 2016, for 2 years of that survey, we specifically asked the question that, how many years on this field in which you're reporting yield data have you consistently or consecutively used cover crops versus the fields where you haven't? And the interesting trend that we saw is that growers that had more experience and growers that had used cover crops for 3, 5, or 7 years consistently were actually showing greater yield increases over growers that had just started using cover crops. And so, I think the information that basically you can convey from this is that when we're using cover crops, and this is really what that economics bulletin is demonstrating, is that initially in the first couple of years, you may not actually see revenue increases because you do have seed costs, and maybe we haven't seen any type of yield increases, and we don't have that experience to be able to reduce inputs for fertility or herbicide. But by years 3, 4, and 5, we're consistently starting to see the fact that those revenues outpace any additional costs associated with the seed for cover crops, et cetera. And I think, at least in my opinion, what we're seeing is two things. One, by years 4 and 5, we're starting to see some of those longer term benefits: greater water infiltration, possible increases in soil organic matter, better aggregate stability. The second thing is I think we just get better with more experience in terms of how we integrate cover crops into our rotation. So as our management gets better, we're also seeing better results. I think that we need to, as producers, there's a lot of things we do on our farms where we maybe don't see that instant return on investment. I always think of lime as one example, where we're putting lime on in the fall 1 year, not expecting to see any results from that until the second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year. And so I kind of view cover crops in the same way, is that, over time, we're going to see more and more of those benefits. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to wait to be able to see some instant returns on investment. So in the bulletin, we actually go through and outline 7 different ways in which you can speed up that return on investment from the use of cover crops. And I thought I might just cover the first 2 today with examples from our farm, and I hope you can ask questions as it relates to what we're implementing and how we're utilizing covers. So the first one really comes down to the issue of herbicides and weeds. And for me, there's really 2 issues here. One of them is herbicide-resistant weeds, and then the other is just whether or not by using cover crops I can impact my herbicide costs or impact the tank mixes or the chemistry that I'm using on our particular fields. I have found over time that a picture probably does as much to demonstrate something as words do. So this is a field in our farm in which I just ran a test strip. So basically shut off the spreader for seeding cover crops in the fall. And hopefully you can see on the screen that anywhere where I have rye, which is the cover crop I'm using in this particular picture, I don't have any herbicide-resistant mare's tail. So just as an example, this was seeded with rye in the fall. This already has burn down on it. I went back and checked before the seminar today. So this had generic glyphosate combined with Petromoc. So it had a burn down, it had a contact as well as a residual. And as you can see, where I don't have rye and it's already had a burn down, I still have a lot of prevalent mare's tail. I did think it was interesting that both from a biomass perspective as well as a continuing weed control perspective, I didn't necessarily expect that I would see changes throughout the season or more performance from where I had the cover crop planted, but I actually had better seed placement and I had better weed control throughout the season in areas where I had cover crops applied. So that gives you an idea, at least graphically, how cover crops can age from a herbicide resistant weed perspective. But the other, from my important component is just what does it do in terms of input costs, and are there any ways that by using covers, I can impact my annual costs? So I went back to some pictures I had taken back in 2019. So I think of years as to what happens weather-wise, 2012, 2014. Well, 2019 for us was great in terms of seeding corn, and then we turned off cold and wet. And not only did it impact our stands of corn, but it actually delayed soybean planting. And the first field that I was able to plant in 2019 was on June 4th. This is that particular field. So normally we wouldn't think that cereal rye would hold weeds in check, or we wouldn't expect it to hold weeds in check until June 3rd or June 4th. But as we're normally planting soybeans in May. But just by seeing the two pictures here on May 11th and May 30th, you can see this is not quite the same spots, but this is the exact same field taken two different points in time. And you can see that the rye is still doing a really nice job in terms of keeping any small broadleaf weeds held in check. Thought I would follow through. So this is that same field. Again, keep in mind this wasn't planted until the 4th of June. So some pretty heavy biomass in that particular field from the rye. There's a July picture, and I did go back and look. The average soybean yield in Pettis County in 2019 was 48 bushels per acre. In this particular field, planted on June 3rd, did 51.5. So just to give you an idea of two different ways you can look at herbicides and then herbicide resistant weeds and the impact on your particular operation. Just to put a few numbers together, this is taken from that same year. So I'm looking at 4 different fields. Field number 4 on the screen is a control in which I did not have any cover crop planted. So I wanted to highlight that particular field to start with. This is a partial budget analysis. So this is just meant to show changes in cost relative to the baseline. So relative to what I would do normally. So on field number 4, because I had a lot of mare's tail in that field and that initial spray did not do its job, I actually had to come back with a second burn down on that field. So that's that additional $25 that you see on the far right-hand column at the bottom. Fields 1, 2, and 3 all had either cereal rye or a cereal rye industrial rapeseed mix. A little bit difference in terms of seeding rates and so seeding costs. So I wanted to highlight field number 2 because in field number 2, in that particular situation, when I looked at that field, I felt like the rye was doing its job and I did not need to do and put a residual into the tank mix with burn down. So in that particular field, I saved about $25 an acre, which covered off all of my seed and seeding expenses for the year. So just on changes in chemistry in that particular year, it was a break even for me. Now, in fields 1 and 3, when I looked at the potential weed control, I felt like that I needed to put a full tank mix on with burn down. So in those particular fields, I had an additional cost of around $38 per acre. So hopefully you'll understand that, this is a field by field scenario in terms of looking at where you can see additional costs or in some cases, additional savings. And then just to kind of emphasize, this is from the 2020 survey that was done by CTIC, ASTA, and SARE. And I think that the main point that I wanted to get across is that I believe there was more than 500 producers that responded to this survey, is that, not just on average, but more than 2/3 of the growers responded basically saying that they felt like that they either had no change or a savings in terms of herbicide costs with the same or better weed control, and that cover crops can do an excellent job of being able to keep weeds in check, but also to be able to potentially reduce some of your input costs. So just to switch gears now to a second area that I wanted to be able to emphasize, and that's how to potentially integrate grazing with cover crops, and just to be able to kind of jump to the bottom line or the striking point. If you are diversified, if for example you have a cow-calf operation or maybe you do some backgrounding, and you can integrate cover crops into that grazing rotation, you can, in my estimation, really make cover crops pay on an annual basis. Just a little bit more about our particular operation. I'm limited in terms of labor. I've tried multiple seeding methods, aerial, no-till drill. I've used a Kinsey planter, but I've gone back to essentially using a pendulum spreader, just from being able to get over more acres right during harvest. So we are what I would call rotational no-till. So the only tool we use is to run a vertical till tool over corn stalks in the fall. It also happens to be our method for seeding. So if I'm using large seeded like cereal rye, I'll apply the seed and then run the vertical till tool. I wanted to be able to show you on that picture on the right-hand side that we're getting very little disturbance in terms of the soil, just trying to break that residue down a little bit. If I'm applying a mix where I've got a brassica or a small seeded crop in there, I'll actually do it just the opposite, which is to run the vertical till tool and then to seed over the top. And, 4 out of 5 years, Mother Nature takes care of me, and we're just able to use moisture to be able to get that seed up and established, and have really never had any issues in terms of getting seed established in the fall. So we will, on some fields, try to do fall grazing with our cow-calf operation, but always we'll do spring grazing prior to termination. The one thing I wanted to highlight here is that after doing this for a few years, gaining some experience, we actually modified our management practices slightly. So what we found is that if we planted just a little bit of 102-day or short day corn, year in, year out, yields were pretty similar. Again, we're moisture limited in terms of our soil. So there's actually a couple of years in which that 102-day corn was one of the best yielding varieties on our farm. But by planting that 102-day corn, we almost always guaranteed that we would get at least one field in early and get sufficient height on that cover crop to ensure grazing in the fall. So it's just interesting how cover crops actually, by integrating them in, have changed our management practices to a small degree. And again, just trying to show you a little bit from a picture perspective. This is a couple of fields. The one on the left has never been grazed. That's a John Deere Gator. So you can see that that's chest tall cereal rye. The field in the middle has been grazed a couple of times. And we just had a lot of moisture. And so I was using that as my sacrifice field. I did want to show you, though, the picture on the far right-hand side. So that cover crop, that rye, has been grazed twice, and it's been grazed pretty hard. But yet a picture taken on that exact same day in that field shows you that it's still doing a pretty nice job of keeping those small broadleaf weeds in check from a weed control perspective. So how might we think about this from a profitability or from a return perspective for grazing? And it really depends upon whether or not you're thinking this and you have a cow-calf operation, or whether or not you're backgrounding, you're running stockers. So this evaluation I'm showing you is from our perspective, where we're running a commercial cow-calf operation. And essentially, any return from the use of cover crops is seen in terms of hay that is not being fed. So what is the value of that hay that we don't have to put up and or buy? What I've outlined here is the fact is that I would intend to be able to do a little bit of fall grazing, and then graze it more significantly in the spring. So in both cases, because I've just got these economics set up as if it's an open field grazing, so not management intensive in terms of stringing wire, moving them every day or two. So I've actually assumed that there's going to be a lot of waste, whether through hoof action or whether through selective grazing, that they'll only get about half of that potential value out of the cover crop in the field. I've then estimated the number of pounds of biomass that would be harvested through the animal, and then compared that back to feeding hay in terms of dry matter, how much might be wasted in the feedlot. Included in that, the cost associated with feeding the hay in terms of labor in the months of February, March, as well as the depreciation cost of that particular tractor. And then also assume just a little bit more management by having to manage the cows that are grazing. So all in and on average, it's fairly easy to assume that you can see about $50 per acre in terms of value from grazing that cover crop. Two more points I guess I'd like to make. The first one is that picture on the left is actually from this year, and we had a wet May, so we were third week of May, I think, before we got back into the field. And as you can see, there's a lot of biomass on that particular field. I'm just using a split row Kinsey planter, and using mechanical springs, don't have hydraulic downforce, but still doing a pretty good job in terms of seed placement. The second thing I wanted to highlight is this is a cow-calf analysis in terms of the potential returns or revenue or increased value. I think, though, you could build a really strong case that if you have an operation where you're either grass finishing or whether you're doing some backgrounding through the use of cover crops in March and April, cool season grasses, May, June, maybe a warm season native or a warm season annual, July, August, and then move back into the fall grazing of cool season grasses and potentially cover crops in the fall, where you can get some really nice average daily gains on an animal incorporating warm season annuals or warm season natives along with the grazing of cover crops. A real nice system potentially to look at. Again, looking at this from an economic perspective, trying to tie this back in, I went back. These are all numbers from the same fields in the same year. So I took those same four fields that you looked at on a herbicide basis. Again, that field number 4 on the right-hand side, that's a control, no cover crop, no grazing. If you remember, field number 2, I had slightly better weed control. I gave up and didn't put a residual in the tank mix, and so I had some savings on field number 2. But field number 1 and field number 3, I felt like I needed to go ahead and have a full tank mix. And so there were additional costs associated with those fields. But those happened to be the same fields that I was grazing. One of the fields I fall grazed and spring grazed, and one of the fields I ended up grazing twice in the spring. So when I went through and did the math and the estimates in terms of how much biomass I removed based upon height, I felt like that essentially in one field I had about $40 of savings or benefit and closer to $60 in the other field. Or conversely, what I would say is that in both cases, the benefit from grazing was greater than the additional costs associated with the seed, as well as no-till drilling that seed into the ground. You'll also notice that I did have a higher seeding rate on fields 1 and 3. I put some additional biomass on those particular fields. And I guess the last thing I would say on the grazing side is don't spend some time experimenting and think about how you can possibly integrate innovative ideas. I was actually at a meeting one time when I heard a gentleman speak from Georgia who was talking about grazing canola. So he was trying to think about how he could integrate grazing canola and still harvest it much in the same way that they would handle winter wheat in the Great Plains. Well, I didn't necessarily need to harvest the winter canola, but the numbers that he was showing on protein levels and gains were pretty outstanding. So we've actually tried integrating winter canola for a few years into our operation, and it has been successful. I haven't done it for a couple of years, but every year that I have done it, we've been pleased. The main thing to consider here is that from a seed perspective, you would want to use open pollinated seed. You wouldn't want to use herbicide tolerant seed because then that canola, that cover crop, could actually become a weed in your system of soybeans or corn. If you plant canola in our area before the 1st of October, you have a nice opportunity to be able to get some growth before your first killing frost. And the interesting thing about canola is that after that first killing frost is actually the time that you would want to graze it. You have those Brix levels in the leaves, so those sugars are converted whenever you have that hard freeze. It was interesting to watch the cattle in these particular fields because the first day or two, it took them a couple of days to realize what they had, but after that they really stood on their heads, and we felt pretty comfortable and good about integrating canola in just as a cover crop to be able to graze in our particular operation. So that's a couple of examples about how we've both integrated covers into our operation and where I feel like I've either see savings on the input side or whether I see some revenue gains from grazing potential. Just as I'm finishing up, I wanted to return back. Those are just 2 of the 7 ways that we've outlined in this economics bulletin. The others are just as significant. I remember speaking to a grower in Arkansas who told me that his no-till drill has become his inline ripper, and that so he's done some tougher soils as he described them in Arkansas, and he would use an inline ripper every year. But after switching to cover crops, he felt like that he was getting enough breakup in terms of compaction issues that he no longer needed to run that ripper. We also see a lot of growers that are transitioning from either conservation tillage or rotational no-till into full no-till, where the use of cover crops has helped to speed up that transition. Going back to that data from 2012, where we had some extreme stress and drought conditions, a lot of times, I guess I just think of it from this perspective. If we're able to build soil organic matter and or just to get better water infiltration, so that if we get a inch and a half rain, that we get almost an inch and a half in the ground, being able to have that additional moisture, what's the value of an additional three-fourths of an inch or an inch of rain in July or August at the right time? And I see that's where we see a lot of benefits over time in terms of improvements of soil health. Have also seen quite a few individuals that have been able to adjust nutrient levels or the amount of fertilizer that's applied. And so if we think about fertilizer, there's multiple ways that we could benefit from the use of cover crops. Uh, you could incorporate a legume into your cover crop mix and possibly get a nitrogen credit. But even more so, by being able to do, plant cover crops in the fall, if we do have any excess nitrogen in the soil, that cover crop is able to take that nitrogen up without having it move out through a tile drain, as an example. And we're able to cycle that and then release that nitrogen back the next growing season. By keeping soil on our farm versus soil erosion, we're able to keep P and K in that particular field. And quite a few growers over time have been able to show themselves that they can get by with a slightly lower amount of fertilizer on their particular fields. And then I guess the last thing I would highlight is that there are a lot of programs out there to be able to help offset some of the costs of seed. There are programs such as NRCS's EQIP and CSP, which you could apply for. There are programs such as the Farmers for Soil Health that are working to incentivize and encourage the adoption of practices such as cover crops. And then, of course, with the carbon markets, which are developing, there are other possible programs out there on a private basis to be able to encourage climate smart ag practices such as cover crops to be able to sequester additional carbon. So all potential opportunities to help offset some of your costs on an annual basis. And let me just leave you with this. There are a lot of things that we do on our farms where we don't see an automatic return in the first year. I think at a base level with cover crops, it may take a few years for us to be able to fully realize those returns unless we have situations like grazing or reducing herbicide costs, et cetera. Most producers realize more benefits the longer that you use cover crops in your operation. And I'm of the belief that it's a combination of the benefits, but also just our experience that we get better at how we integrate those into our operation. If you're diversified, I think grazing is a slam dunk in terms of returns on investment. And at least from my experience, it did take me a few years to be able to convince myself that I could actually change my tank mixes and reduce some of my inputs, but I'm comfortable with it now. And so I think there's plenty of opportunities there as well. So just experiment and gain and learn from your experiences. And with that, Olivia, I hope that there are some questions that maybe we can get to specific to other operations.
Thank you so much, Alan. That was wonderful. A lot of great information. With your farming experience combined with your expertise in economics, it's really helpful to hear your experiences. We encourage questions in that Q&A. We don't have any yet, but we did have some questions submitted through the registration that we can go ahead and get started with. Thinking about combating herbicide resistance, other than cereal rye, which you mentioned, are there specific cover crop species or mixes that you have found work particularly well as a weed suppressant that are also economical?
Yeah, so great question. Well, I'd have to say, first of all, that cereal rye probably is the most forgiving cover crop that I've worked with. It's the easiest to start with. It's the one I encourage any grower that is, planting a cover crop for the first time to be able to trial with. It also happens to have allelopathic effects on weeds. And so whenever we think about weed control, a lot of times cereal rye is the first one that we kind of go to. After that, a lot of times what I turn to is seeding rate. So you can have impacts by what cover crop you use. You can also have impacts by the amount of biomass that's on your particular field. So rye, of course, works with allelopathy, but we're trying to shade out those weed seeds, keeping them from germinating. And so if I'm doing something besides rye, I typically try to get more biomass on that field. And so then whenever I no-till into that, I've got more, and then terminate it, I've got a lot more coverage. It helps me from evapotranspiration's perspectives in terms of losing moisture, but it also keeps those weed seeds from germinating. So I would encourage, seeding rate is, and the amount of biomass is probably just as important in some cases after you get past rye.
Very helpful. And if someone has a question and doesn't want to type it in the chat, you can use that raise hand feature and we can let you come off mute if that's easier for you. Another question was, what implement do you use to broadcast your seed ahead of corn and beans?
Yeah, so nothing special. The first thing I'll say is that again, I've experimented with a lot of different types. We still have a no-till drill, and if time, the best seed to soil contact is going to be from a no-till drill. It just so happens that my no-till drill is 15 feet, and so therefore I don't get a lot of coverage in terms of acres per hour. There's a lot of good applicators out there from an aerial perspective. I don't know that I've been truly happy with the spread pattern from an aerial perspective. And then I have, depends on the cover crop and how you're set up. I have used a planter before as well to be able to seed. I went back just to using a pendulum spreader versus a spinner. I like the pendulum spreader. It lets me cover 15, 18 acres an hour. And in the fall, that's important for me. But of course, you'll have to have incorporation with that unless you let moisture be the way that you get your cover crops to germinate.
Lots of options. And sticking with using cover crops as a weed suppressant, from your experience, how does the decision to plant green or terminate early impact cover crops working as a weed suppressant?
Yeah, so obviously the later you terminate, the more biomass that you're going to have. And this year, as an example, the cereal rye was up to my chest essentially, and we're planting into that. So once it got laid down, there was a solid mat of biomass, which did a really nice job of keeping weeds in check. The earlier you terminate, you might have less biomass, or in the case of where we graze, sometimes we have less biomass than I would desire. And so in that particular case, we're more dependent upon chemistry and a post-emerge spray to be able to keep weeds under control.
And of course, for beginners, late termination would be considered a more advanced technique.
Yeah, Olivia, it's a good point. So it took me, I've been planting and using cover crops since 2006, maybe not every year starting in 2006, but the last decade or two I have. And it took me a long time before planting green. And so planting green, of course, is whenever you're planting into a living cover crop versus terminating it before planting. And we've been successful at that. And no, we don't feel like we've taken necessarily any changes in terms of our yields. Although not this growing season, but last growing season, it was nip and tuck because it turned off so dry in our particular area. I mentioned the fact that we were in a D3 drought, and there was less soil, water in that soil profile. So early on, those beans planted did not necessarily look outstanding, but yield-wise, at the end, they came on and did just fine.
In switching to the concept of cover crop grazing, which you covered, what advice do you have for producers to establish new fencing or watering, as that's a common barrier to incorporating livestock?
Yeah, so we happen to be in a nice situation with the way our farm is laid out, because I had mentioned the fact that we, row crop less than half of our farm. So we actually have water available in most of the regions, and so we don't necessarily have to bring water out to those particular fields. I guess there's two things I would encourage. The one is that if you're just getting started, you don't have to go management intensive at the very beginning. So it is just fine to be able to open, the gate up, so to speak, get those cattle into that field, let them openly graze. They can move back to a water source. Once you get your feet wet, get more experience, there are definitely cost share programs out there available through NRCS to help offset some of the costs associated with water. And I would look into those.
Great. And sticking with that cover crop grazing, what advice do you have for avoiding compaction issues?
Yeah, so compaction is something that I was very concerned about when we first started grazing a number of years ago. And it took both experience and a number of journal articles and research articles to convince me that cows are actually not putting that much more compaction into the field. It's not as significant as I initially thought, and as a lot of growers think. Now, having said that, there's two things that we do. One of them is if we get a lot of rain in the forecast, we'll line out what we would call a sacrifice field, where we will move the cattle into that one particular field whenever it's wet. And because what I have found and what I don't like is whenever it's wet, you have a lot of hoof prints. And of course, the most important thing about getting a good yield is to get a good stand. And if you're seeding an inch, inch and a half, inch and 3/4 deep, but you have hoof imprints that are 2 inches deep, it does lead me to issues in terms of planting. So that's actually been a bigger concern of mine than compaction at this point in time. But that's what we tend to do is we lay one field out as a sacrifice field and move them onto that field whenever it gets wet.
Great advice. Now, do you follow a particular plan for timing your grazing and how long you allow the livestock to graze?
No, nothing is the same every year. So it's really just by feel and experience. The main thing I would say is that you get a lot more vegetative quality out of that rye when it's in the forage state, before it's going to go up into boot. And rye will get away from you really quick, to the point where whenever that rye is 6, 7, 8, 9 inches tall, you really want to have cows grazing on it because it won't be too long before the rye will outgrow, unless you have just the exact right number of cows on that particular field. So it's really just every year is different. We've had a couple of years where we weren't able to graze until into March, where we would have assumed they already would have been on that field once or for a week or two, and we would have taken them off. And that's just because of the growing conditions.
Now, we had a question come in that asked, have you looked into covers being a third crop between row crops for cash?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. As we see more and more cover crops being used, we have to make the assumption that there needs to be the appropriate amount of cover crop seed produced as well. So I do think there are opportunities for growers that might want to produce cover crop seed. A lot of our cover crop seed is produced in the Pacific Northwest, and because of climatic conditions, that's probably where it's going to stay focused. But in the case of rye, as an example, or triticale, we should be able to have regional production, and there could be opportunities for growers to be able to grow that under contract with a seed producer. There are also a new crop or a new set of oil seeds, which are planted as a winter annual, which could be an opportunity. I need to make sure to distinguish, though, that those crops, that would be things like camelina or brassica carinata or covercress, are not technically cover crops. So that's not a crop, for example, that would meet the requirements of NRCS programs because they're harvested. But they are crops that are planted during that fallow time period, and they do provide some of those same ecosystem service benefits, some of those functional benefits of a cover crop, but they're harvested. So technically not a cover crop. And the same would be true for producing cover crops for seed, because once it's harvested, it's considered different.
That's a good distinction, especially when we're talking about these cost share programs that are available to producers. And to wrap up, one more question for you. You described yield increases. Actually, you described cover crop economics vary on a field by field basis. And like investment in equipment, it can take time to see those economic returns. For a producer getting started with cover crops, what advice would you give them for selecting a field more likely to provide economic benefits sooner?
Well, it's not going to surprise you that if you're diversified, I would say, one that's located in an area where you can graze it. I do believe that's the quickest way to see economic return. After that, I would say that, if you have a field where you consistently have some erosion, that's another area where I would target. I didn't highlight this, but I think as growers, sometimes we don't value our time very well. So, and just to give you an example, if I have a field where I have a cover crop, the chances are that I will probably not have to go in there with a skid steer and do any kind of dirt work to fix, ruts or anything like that, or into tile drains, whatever it may be. If I don't have a cover crop on a particular field, at least where we're located, we got quite a bit of slope. I'm probably going to have to spend several hours on that particular field just getting some things worked out before planting season. So when you consider the depreciation on a skid steer and your time at, say, $20 an hour, it quickly adds up into, on a per acre basis. It could be $3, $4, $5, $8 per acre, just in terms of your time and then wear and tear on a skid steer or a traco or something like that. So grazing would be the first opportunity. The second would be areas where you have some issues in terms of soil erosion. I would always have a cover crop on that field if possible, and you'll see some savings right away just in terms of fixing that. And then after that, no promises, because it's a year by year decision as to whether or not you change chemistry, reduce inputs, things like that. You really just have to like walk that field and then make a decision each year.
Fantastic. Well, you know that farming is a business and economics is most important for keeping our farms going. And with that, I will go ahead and close this out. Thank you all for tuning in today. This has been a really wonderful discussion. We appreciate Alan's time and you joining us. If you'd like to hear more from Alan, check out his recorded video presentation, which was part of the 2017 National Conference on Cover Crops and Soil Health. Anne Marie just shared that link in the chat for us. In this video presentation, Alan talks about cover crops through the lens of a mid-sized diversified crop and livestock producer. Also, remember, Farmers for Soil Health provides cover crop cost share opportunities, which you can learn more about at farmersforsoilhealth.com. Our partners at the Soil Health Institute will also share a link to SHI economic resources that you can check out. Once we close out, a short Zoom survey will pop up. We would greatly appreciate it if you would take less than a minute to give us your feedback so we can continue to make improvements. And as you've seen on the screen, we have one upcoming webinar, September 19th, about using a cover crop selector tool. That information will be available in the follow-up email, and the registration link was also just dropped in the chat. And with that, could you go to our next slide, Alan? We're able to offer one CCA CEU credit for this webinar. You can request the credit by scanning the QR code. You'll need to scan this code through your CCA app on your mobile device. You'll select scan course code, or if that doesn't work for you, you can send me an email and I'm happy to get that credit added to your account. Keep a lookout for an email next week with the webinar recording, upcoming webinar registration, and additional resources along with that final feedback survey. And if you have any other questions, feel free to contact us. You can, yes, thank you, Alan. That's our contact information. And thank you again. We hope you have a great rest of your day.